My son opened the back door without knocking, the way he always did, like the house had been his since before I bought it. He came in smiling, carrying a paper bag that smelled like the barbecue place on Route 9, and right behind him was a man in a charcoal suit who I'd never seen before in my life. The stranger had a briefcase and a careful expression, the kind of face people wear when they've been paid to look trustworthy. My son said, "Dad, this is going to be simple, I promise. Just a few signatures and we can all have lunch." Then he saw the woman sitting at my kitchen table with a yellow legal pad and a cup of coffee, and every muscle in his body went rigid. The paper bag dropped about 2 inches before he caught it. The man in the charcoal suit bumped into him from behind, and my son, who had never once in 42 years been at a loss for words, stood in my doorway and couldn't produce a single one. 3 months before that morning, I would have done almost anything just to get him to return a phone call. My name is Raymond Goss. I'm 72 years old, and I live in a split level on the east side of Knoxville, Tennessee, in a neighborhood where the dogwoods go absolutely insane every April, and the neighbors still wave from their driveways. I spent 38 years as a civil engineer for the county. Roads, bridges, drainage systems, the kind of work most people never think about until something floods. I wasn't famous at it. I was steady at it, and steady turned out to be enough. When I retired, I had a pension, a paid-off house, a woodworking shop in the garage that I'd been promising myself for decades, and roughly zero reasons to be in a hurry about anything. My wife Elaine passed 8 years ago. Pancreatic cancer, 6 weeks from diagnosis to the end. That kind of fast is its own particular cruelty. You spend the first week in shock, the second week trying to be useful, and by the third you've already started mourning because the person in front of you is already starting to disappear. We had 34 years together, raised 2 kids, traveled some, argued about the thermostat more than anything else in life. I still keep it at 68 because she always said anything warmer made her feel like she was on a bus, and I can't bring myself to change it. My son Derek is 44. My daughter Paula is 40. Paula lives out in Flagstaff with her husband and my 2 grandchildren, and we talk every Sunday without fail. She asks real questions and listens to the answers. She's that kind of person. Derek is a different story, and I've spent a long time trying to be fair about that. He's smart, genuinely smart, could talk his way into or out of nearly anything. Went into commercial real estate in his early 30s, and for a while, it looked like he'd found his thing. He and his wife Stacy bought a house in a nice part of town, leased a new truck every 2 years, put the kids in private school. I didn't ask too many questions. That was probably my first mistake. When Elaine died, Derek came home for the funeral and stayed 4 days. He helped with the arrangements, shook hands with everyone, said the right things. A week after he left, he called to check on me, and those calls kept coming, every few days at first, then weekly, then monthly. Then the silences between started getting longer, and I told myself people have their own lives, and left it at that. About a year and a half ago, the calls came back, more often than they'd been in years. At first, I was just glad to hear from him. We'd talk about football, about the grandkids, about what I was building in the shop, normal things. But after a few weeks, I noticed a current underneath the conversation, something pulling in a direction I couldn't quite name. He started asking about the house. Was I keeping up with the maintenance? Had I thought about what the property was worth in today's market? Did I know that a lot of folks my age were simplifying? He made it sound like concern. He's good at that. I didn't say anything the first few times. I swallowed it the way you do when you don't want to be the father who reads too much into everything. Then one evening he called while I was in the shop, hands full of sawdust, and he asked me flat out if I'd thought about getting my affairs organized. He used that exact phrase, getting my affairs organized. I said I thought they were organized just fine. He said, well, it might be good to have somebody professional look things over, just to be sure, for peace of mind. His, I realized later, not mine. I want to stop here for just a second, because if you're a parent, you know the specific confusion of that moment. The moment when your child says something that could be care or could be something else entirely, and you don't know which one it is, and the not knowing makes you feel slightly crazy. You think, am I being unfair? Am I that suspicious old man who doesn't trust his own kid? And so you let it go. You choose to believe the generous version because the other version is too painful to sit with. I let it go for about 4 months. What changed things was a Tuesday afternoon in October. I ran into a woman named Loretta Ferris at the hardware store. I'd known Loretta and her husband Frank for going on 20 years. Neighborhood people. The kind you see at the 4th of July and the occasional block party. Frank pulled me aside while Loretta pretended to look at weather stripping, and he said, "Raymond, this is none of my business, and you can tell me so. But I heard something the other day I think you should know about." He told me Derek had run into him at a sports bar, and after a beer or two had started talking about me. Said I was having some trouble lately. Trouble with memory, trouble keeping track of things. Losing my edge, Derek called it. Said he was worried and was trying to figure out how to help manage things going forward. Frank watched me process that, and then he said, "I didn't want to say anything, but Loretta said I had to." And then he went and found his wife, and they bought their weather stripping, and left me standing in the aisle, holding a box of wood screws I hadn't needed in the first place. I drove home slowly. I want to be honest with you about what happened inside me during that drive, because it wasn't anger, not yet. It was something more disorienting than that. It was the feeling of the floor shifting under your feet. Because what Derek had done, telling people I was losing my edge, wasn't just a lie. It was a specific kind of lie. It was the kind designed to make you doubt yourself, to make people around you start watching you differently, so that later, when something happens, everyone already has a story in their head about why. I sat in my driveway for a good 10 minutes, thinking about the last 2 years, all the small moments I'd filed away without looking at too hard, and suddenly they were all lined up and pointing the same direction. That night I called my daughter Paula. I told her everything I just told you. She listened without interrupting, which is a gift not everyone has. When I finished, there was a pause, and then she said, "Dad, I need to tell you something I should have told you sooner." She said Derek had called her about 3 months back. Said he was worried about me, wanted to get her thoughts on how to handle it. She'd assumed it was genuine brotherly concern. She hadn't said anything to me because she didn't want to upset me. She said, "I'm sorry, Dad. I should have trusted my instincts." Then she said something that changed the whole direction of what happened next. She said, "You need to call Margaret." Margaret Cho had been the senior accountant at the county engineering office for the last 12 years of my career. She was meticulous in a way that bordered on beautiful. She could look at a column of numbers and see what was wrong with it the way some people can hear a wrong note in a song. When I retired, she'd taken over my project load without missing a single deadline. She moved back to Tennessee after her own retirement, about 40 minutes east of Knoxville, and we'd stayed in loose touch the way old colleagues do. Christmas cards, the occasional lunch. I called her at 8:30 that night. We talked for almost 2 hours. She wasn't surprised, which surprised me. She said she'd seen versions of this before, not accusatory, just careful. She asked me to pull together whatever financial paperwork I had, mortgage documents, account statements, the deed on the house, my pension paperwork, and she said she'd come by on Saturday and we'd just take a look. She arrived Saturday morning with a tote bag full of her own files, and a calm that I found steadying. We spread everything across the kitchen table, and she started reading the way she always read, slowly, twice, and with a pencil. She asked questions as she went. Had anyone requested copies of anything from me recently? Had Derek ever asked to be listed anywhere on an account? Had I received any paperwork I didn't fully understand and signed because it seemed routine? That last question landed somewhere uncomfortable. About 6 months back, Derek had mailed me a document he described as a standard medical directive update. He said everyone should have one. He'd already filled in the basic information to save me the trouble. Just needed my signature and a witness. I'd glanced at it, thought it looked reasonable, and signed it. My neighbor's wife had witnessed it. I'd never thought about it again until that exact moment sitting at my kitchen table with Margaret's pencil hovering in the air. "I don't have a copy," I said. Margaret looked at me with an expression I can only describe as carefully neutral. She said, "Let's find out what Derek sent you." It took about a week and a half of phone calls and written requests, but we eventually got a copy through the county recorder's office where it had been filed. Margaret read it for a long time. Then she set it down and pushed it toward me and pointed to a section on the 3rd page that I had absolutely not understood when I signed it. The medical directive was real, but attached to it, embedded in the same document using language that was designed to read as boilerplate, was a durable financial power of attorney. Activated not just in cases of incapacitation, but in cases of, and I'm quoting here, documented cognitive decline, as determined by a licensed medical professional or 2 adult witnesses. 2 adult witnesses. Not a court, not a doctor. 2 people willing to say I seemed off. I sat there reading that paragraph 3 times. Margaret didn't say anything. She let me sit. When I finally looked up, I said, he had this filed 6 months ago. She nodded. I said, before any of this started. She nodded again. And I understood then what I'd been refusing to understand for more than a year. This wasn't an impulsive thing, a bad idea Derek cooked up when things got hard. This was planned. My son had planned this. The casual calls, the subtle comments about my memory, the story he was seeding with people like Frank, all of it was preparation. He was building a paper trail of concern, so that when the time came, the two witnesses he needed would already be primed. I'd be standing in the shop trying to remember what I'd come in for, and Derek's voice would float into my head, losing his edge. I'd be eating breakfast and I'd think about that signature I put on a document I didn't read carefully enough, and I'd feel something between shame and fury that I didn't quite know what to do with. I kept trying to find the innocent version. Maybe he genuinely meant the medical directive, and the financial piece was just an overzealous attorney. Maybe the story about my memory was something Frank misheard. Maybe I was the one constructing a conspiracy out of ordinary pieces. I called Paula again. I told her what we'd found. She went quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Dad, how much debt do you think Derek has?" I said I had no idea. She said, "Stacy called me 6 weeks ago. She said things are really bad. 2 mortgages, a line of credit, some kind of investment that went sideways. She said Derek doesn't know she called me." There it was. The whole shape of it, finally visible. Margaret had an old colleague who still practiced estate law. His name was Victor, and he was the kind of attorney who wore reading glasses on a chain and said very little but meant all of it. He agreed to meet with us, and he reviewed everything we'd gathered. Afterward, he explained to us, quietly and without dramatics, what Derek's document would have made possible, and then he explained what we could do about it. We spent the next 6 weeks being methodical. Victor filed paperwork to supersede the document Derek had recorded. He drafted a proper irrevocable trust, correctly done, properly witnessed. My estate was restructured in a way that took the house, the pension accounts, and the savings entirely out of reach of any financial power of attorney, regardless of what any document said or who signed what. By the time Derek called in late November to suggest that maybe we should sit down and get a few things organized, everything he'd been positioning himself to access for the past year was already locked behind a door that had no key he could reach. I agreed to meet him. I told him I had some paperwork I wanted to go through with him, which was true, and that I'd like to have another person present, which he took to mean I was admitting I needed help managing things. I could hear the relief in his voice. He said, "Of course, Dad, that's completely fine," and he offered to bring someone too, a professional, someone he trusted, just to make sure everything was handled right. I said that would be fine. I thought a lot in those days about what kind of man I wanted to be in that room. I've known people who'd have shown up with a speech, people who'd have rehearsed every word they planned to say. I understand that impulse. But I've been an engineer for 4 decades, and what engineers know is that the structure is the argument. You don't have to explain a bridge that holds. You just have to build it right and let it stand. The morning they came, Margaret was already at the table. She'd been there since 8, going through documents one more time, not because she needed to, but because that's who she is. The kitchen smelled like coffee. Outside, the dogwood in the front yard had gone bare for winter. I was calm in a way that surprised me, the kind of calm that comes not from having no feelings, but from having already felt all of them. Derek came in the back door without knocking. He came in smiling. "You know what happened next. I told you at the start. What I haven't told you yet is what happened after the paper bag stopped dropping," and Derek found his voice again. He said, "Dad, what is she doing here?" He said it the way people say things when they're trying to reframe a situation they've just lost control of. I said, "She's here because I asked her to be." Margaret didn't look up from her legal pad. The man in the charcoal suit introduced himself. His name was Gary, and I actually felt a little sorry for Gary, because I don't think Gary knew half of what he'd been brought into. He handed me a folder with a polite smile and explained that he'd been asked to help me review my estate planning documents, and that Derek had been kind enough to explain my situation. I asked Gary what Derek had explained. Gary hesitated. He said Derek had mentioned some concerns, some confusion I'd been experiencing around financial matters, some memory issues that had been affecting my day-to-day. I let that sit for a moment. Then I said, "Gary, have you ever spoken with me before today?" He said no. I said, "Has any doctor or any professional of any kind provided you with documentation of these concerns?" He shifted in his chair. He said, "No, I was just going off what I'd been told." I nodded. I said, "What you were told isn't accurate. Then I asked him to open his folder and find the section related to authority over financial accounts in cases of cognitive decline. He found it. I asked him to read the language aloud. He did, slowly. His face changed as he read. Derek said, "Dad, this is really not how I wanted this to go." His voice had changed too. The salesman warmth was mostly gone. I said, "I know. I imagine you wanted it to go quite differently." Then I opened my own folder, the one Victor had prepared, and I walked them through it. The superseding document, the irrevocable trust, the new directives, correctly and legally executed, witnessed by two people with absolutely no relationship to my family and every relationship to accuracy. I told Derek what the original document he'd filed had contained. I named the section. I named the provision. I watched his face as I did it. He tried twice to interrupt. The first time I said, "Let me finish." The second time, Margaret looked up from her legal pad and said nothing, just looked at him, and somehow that was more effective. When I was done, the kitchen was quiet. Gary was looking at his own folder like he was seeing it for the first time. Derek was looking at the table. I said, "I don't have any interest in involving lawyers beyond what's already been done. I don't have any interest in making this ugly. But I want you to understand something clearly. I am not confused. I am not declining. And I am not available." Derek said, "Dad, I was just trying to help. Things are really hard right now." I said I knew things were hard. I said I was sorry things were hard. And I meant that genuinely. Because he is still my son, and I know what it looks like when someone is drowning and reaching for whatever's closest. That doesn't make it acceptable. But it does make it human. I said, "When you're ready to come to me as your father, and not as a financial solution, I'll be right here. That door is open." He left without the folder. Gary gathered his briefcase and apologized on his way out, and I told him I didn't think he'd understood what he'd been brought into, and he nodded in a way that said he agreed with me. Margaret poured herself more coffee. Outside, I heard Derek's truck start up and pull away. I sat there for a while. I won't pretend that felt like winning. It felt like the specific grief of watching someone choose badly and not being able to stop them. A week later, I drove down to a nonprofit I'd known about for years, a workforce development program that trained young people for jobs in infrastructure, surveying, civil drafting, field engineering, the kind of work the county will always need and rarely has enough people to do. I'd been meaning to get involved for years and kept not doing it. I made a significant donation to their scholarship fund and signed on as a volunteer instructor. Twice a month, I go in and work with whoever wants to know how roads get built and why that matters. The first day I walked in, a young woman named Adriana, maybe 22 years old, asked me why drainage systems fail. We ended up talking for 40 minutes. Driving home, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time, purposeful in the right direction, not toward protecting what I had, toward building what comes next. Paula called that evening, and I told her about it. She said, "Mom would have loved that." I said I thought so too. Derek didn't reach out for almost 5 months. I didn't call him either. Not because I was punishing him, but because I understood that whatever needed to shift in him had to shift on its own. You can't hurry that kind of reckoning. He called on a Sunday in April. Paula's call had already come and gone that morning. I was out on the back porch, watching two squirrels argue about the bird feeder, which I maintained purely to enjoy that argument, when the phone buzzed and showed Derek's name. I answered. He sounded like himself, but quieter somehow. We talked about nothing for a few minutes, the cautious weather talk of people who've hurt each other and aren't sure yet how far the ground will hold. Then he said, "Dad, I need to say something to you." I said, "Okay." He said, "What I was doing wasn't protecting you. I was protecting myself, and I told myself they were the same thing, and I think I believed it for a while because it was easier than admitting how bad things had gotten." I didn't say anything for a moment. Then I said, "I know." He said, "I'm sorry." There was nothing attached to it. No ask, no qualifier, no, and so I was hoping. Just those two words hanging there in the April air. I thought about Elaine. I thought about Derek at 9 years old building a birdhouse in the garage with me, the lopsided one that's still in the backyard holding together out of pure stubbornness. I thought about the Sunday phone calls I used to get from him years ago, before the debt and the pressure and whatever dark math he'd started doing in his head. I said, "I love you." He said, "I love you too, Dad." And neither one of us said anything for a few seconds. Then I said, "When you're ready to come down to Knoxville, come down. We'll go to the hardware store and get what we need and build something in the shop, he said. Yeah, yeah, I'd like that. We haven't gotten there yet, but I believe we will. Here's what I want to leave you with, because I've been thinking about how to say this right. There's a version of this story that ends with me, the clean winner, and Derek, the simple villain, and that version isn't honest. The honest version is messier and sadder, and I think more useful to you. Derek was my child before he was someone who disappointed me. He will be my child after. That's not weakness. That's just the arithmetic of loving someone for 44 years. But here is what I also know, what I finally let myself understand after a year of looking away from it. You can love someone completely and still not hand them the keys to your life. You can grieve what they've done and still refuse to pretend it didn't happen. You can hold the door open and still not step aside and let them walk through it, carrying everything you built. Protecting yourself is not a failure of love. Sometimes it's the most honest love there is. The kind that says, I see you clearly, I'm not going to look away, and I'm not going to disappear just because you need me to. So, if you're out there tonight carrying something like this, a relationship that's started to feel like it's costing you more than it should, someone whose concern sounds a little too much like inventory, let me give you one thing you can actually do. Find someone who knew you before the complication. Someone who can sit across a kitchen table from you and say, here's what I actually see. Because most of us, when we're in it, can't see the shape of the thing until someone else points to it. And ask yourself, honestly, is the peace you're keeping real peace, or is it just silence you've mistaken for safety? Because those are not the same thing, and the sooner you know which one you have, the sooner you can decide what to do with it. Before I go, I want to ask you something, and I genuinely want to know what you think. Comment a 1 if you believe I handled it right by meeting Derek privately, instead of publicly. Comment a 2 if you think I should have involved the authorities from the start. And comment a 3 if you think I should have given him a chance to come clean before I restructured everything. I read every single one of these, every one. And tell me where you're watching from tonight and what time it is there right now. Because it moves me to think about how many of us are out there, in different rooms, different cities, different time zones, sitting with versions of the same story. You're not as alone in it as it feels. If you've ever had someone you loved start to see you as a problem to be managed instead of a person to be known, tell me about it in the comments. Someone else reading it might find exactly what they need. If this one stayed with you, please subscribe and come back for the next one. I'll be here. I always am.